effort has been these aerial surveys, both in Red Lake at a kind of more of a fine scale, but also throughout all of northern Ontario at a broad scale. So looking for Wolverine tracks in the snow to try to understand distribution, broad scale level. More interviews at the southern edge of range, trying to understand where exactly that range edge is for Wolverines in the south, and then work on incidental harvest. So trying to understand how we can have trappers using the landscape and harvesting, target species like marten and lynx without getting species like wolverines. A big focus of WCS Canada, in Ontario with wolverines has been working with trappers, and I've continued that with some of my work as well. WCS Canada has been a big part of producing a lot of the research that we get from the boreal. So these are 3 ecozones in North America on the right where wolverines exist. You have the tundra, boreal, and mountains. Lots of the research comes from the mountains, not very much from the boreal. WCS Canada has been a big part of, building that we have a limited understanding in the boreal of wolverine ecology, but, WCS Canada has been a big part of that. You can see a huge increase in peer-reviewed publications as you get towards 2000 in general, with Wolverine research. And I think, that's mostly with the advent of really good smaller GPS collars. Wolverines are really hard to collar. They have necks that are just about as big as their heads. So we needed some good technology to make that work. And remote cameras have been a game changer for Wolverines. Wolverines, this is a map of Wolverine distribution in North America. I always take a little bit of issue with this map just because I think it's a bit misleading, but what it says is, Wolverines were once present throughout the mountains and the tundra and the boreal, but also the plains, for example, of Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, as well as, the temperate and southern boreal forests of the Great Lakes and into New England. I'm not sure if there's ever really, I don't think there's a lot of evidence that there were ever like robust Wolverine populations, in the South, in the prairies and in the temperate areas and the Great Lakes region. Certainly there were Wolverines that were dispersing down into that region, but this is when you hear Wolverines have lost 40% of their range, they're generally talking about this comparison of current and historic range. So I think there's a bit more that goes into that. Where there is real good Wolverine habitat, where they've disappeared, is places like Quebec, northern Labrador, and southern the Rocky Mountains down in Colorado, the Cascades in Oregon, and Sierra Nevadas in California. Those would be considered pretty good Wolverine habitat where they have disappeared. But obviously, if you look at those places, they're very much far on the on the periphery of Wolverine distribution. If you kind of think of where the core of Wolverines are, where they do really, really well, it's that northwest portion of North America. As you get further away from that, you start running into some issues. Wolverines do not have, under Species at Risk Act, they have no status. They are considered species of special concern. They may become threatened or endangered because of a combination of biological characteristics, for example, low density, expansive home ranges, really low reproductive rates, combined with threats generally to their mortality and habitat fragmentation. So trapping is one of them. Industrial development is another. The territorial status kind of mirrored this federal assessment. They're considered kind of vulnerable-ish in all those provinces, threatened in Ontario and Quebec. I think there's been one Wolverine sighting in far northern Quebec, a Wolverine coming down from the north, but there's really not an established population in Quebec and endangered in northern Labrador. And in Ontario, you kind of have a similar story here. It's the idea was that they were province-wide before European settlement. Again, we don't really know that. That's based on some harvest records, and again, I think a lot of that is in the southern part of Ontario, probably a lot of dispersal, from core populations in the north. Whether there was ever huge populations of females with kits down there, I think that's something we don't really know. With European settlement and industrialization, Wolverines moved into the northern parts of the province. By about the 1970s, they were just found in a few portions of northwest Ontario. This is a description of where you find them now. So WCS Canada, in collaboration with the ministry, did extensive aerial surveys for wolverines throughout northern Ontario, looking for wolverine tracks in the snow. And they created this heat map. The hotter colors are places where you're more likely to see wolverine tracks. And you can see, they've reclaimed quite a bit of their distribution in Ontario. Generally, they're focused in that north central and northwest portion, and they start to peter out as you move south and east into the lowlands. So because wolverines are threatened, because there's potentially less than 1,000 in the province, there's a recovery strategy. The goal of the recovery strategy is to maintain wolverine populations and do whatever we can to support natural increases. The government response statement was in response to that recovery strategy. They identified action items for promoting wolverine conservation and management. There's 14 actions identified. 4 of these were high priority action items. And I came in 2017, right after that government response statement, and I've kind of structured the program around addressing some of those action items from the government response statement. And there's been 3 major components to this work, and this is pretty similar to all the WCS Canada scientists. We have our field programs, we have outreach and involvement of people that this really affects, the public, First Nations, trappers, industry, application of what we find to policy. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Red Lake project. So based on that government response statement, we had three objectives: estimate abundance in Red Lake, habitat needs, den site selection. A focus on that for sure. That's something that's throughout the government response statement, is a need to understand where these females are denning. Obviously, females are super important to the sustainability of populations, and develop best management practices for wolverine habitats, specific focus on the effects of forestry. So the Red Lake project is a field-based project. Data collection focuses on live trapping wolverines, tracking them with collars. We started in the spring of 2018. It's mostly winter work because we use bait. If you have bait during the summer, you're going to attract bears and you're going to have all sorts of issues. And then continue, this field work is going to continue through this winter. A big part of our funding is the Species at Risk Stewardship Fund, and this will actually be our last year of funding through them. So in order to try to estimate how many wolverines are on this landscape, we have to detect them. We have 2 different ways of detecting them. One is through run pulls. So we hang some bait from wire, and then the wolverine runs up onto a pole and tries to grab that wire or grab that beaver. When it does that, it exposes itself to some barbed wire, which then we get hair samples for telling unique individuals and sex. And a camera opposite the run pull takes a picture of the wolverine's chest, which actually can be used to identify individuals as well. And then the other picture there is a live trap. So we'll catch wolverines, through a mark recapture. We'll catch them and tag them and put collars on them. So those two ways that we get to estimate abundance. So we have live traps and run pulls. Live traps are in the red, run pulls are in the yellow throughout about a 6,500 square kilometer area in Red Lake. So far, we've documented 31 wolverines at live trap. So pretty skewed towards males, 10 females and 21 males, and 7 wolverines at run pulls. And this is approximately over, pretty much over 2 field seasons. So we've, that what we're finding is generally these females are somewhat rare on the landscape, and they're kind of confined to specific habitats, which we'll touch on here in a second. I always love these, looking at wolverine movement. That's something I'm particularly interested in. But you can see wolverine movement really increases, in the spring, in March, April, May, and that's about the time we have really high capture success. Especially into April, we start catching a lot of different wolverines and new wolverines, because these wolverines are moving around a lot and they're dispersing. So, a lot of those 31 wolverines, we've caught in this March, April period. April 5th, for whatever reason, seems to always be a really good day for wolverines. When we catch these wolverines, we also put GPS collars on them. We've collected about 36,000 GPS locations from wolverines. these Wolverines are moving all over the place, and helping us answer some of our questions related to how they're dealing with this forestry. We get lots of summary type statistics from these Wolverines. People are always interested in how much area they're using. Here's the female medium 95% MCP is about 665. A huge variation, within that, which is why we had to use median. But male median is about 1365. Again, males have a huge range, mostly because we get a lot of males that are dispersing, which really kind of screws up your MCP measurements. But females, we have some dispersals too, which I'll touch on in a second. Another question often is, what are they eating up here? We visit these clusters in the field to understand prey items, and oftentimes we're seeing them focus in on moose and beaver. That's a pretty common prey item in the boreal forest for these Wolverines. Do they travel far? Yes, yes, they do. This is F3. This is pretty neat. It was my birthday, December 8th of last year, and I said all I wanted for my birthday was a reproductive female Wolverine to be caught in one of these traps. And we caught a female Wolverine that day, F3, but she was not reproductive. She was young. Anyway, later that spring, she dispersed up into northern Ontario, all the way up to Muskrat Dam Lake. Females are philopatric, so they stay really close to where they're born. So to see this type of movement from a female is pretty unique. Lots of interesting movements from males too. This Wolverine M3 was caught down in Red Lake and just makes lots of different journeys up into northern Ontario, and then always ends up coming back to Red Lake. There's a carcass, there's some bait piles in that area in Red Lake that he really likes, so he makes these big journeys up and then comes back. I suspect at some point here he'll stay up north and won't come back to Red Lake, but it won't be interesting to see if he's around this year. We have some side projects too. Besides we're doing this tracking project, so we have verified tracks when we let Wolverines and lynx and fishers out of traps. So we can record these tracks and the measurements and take pictures, and then these tracks can be given to citizen scientists to try to test how good they are at identifying tracks in the field for these citizen science projects. So we're collaborating with the Cascades Carnivore Project on that project. We also have all these cameras randomly and non-randomly placed on forestry roads throughout Red Lake. Wolves are a source of mortality for Wolverines. Wolves love to use forestry roads to get around. Trying to understand, what roads wolves like to use most. There's lots of roads on the landscape, varying age, varying condition, varying positions on the landscape. So we're trying to understand their use of these roads through the use of motion sensor cameras in both winter and summer. These are some data from the summer of 2019. Obviously, trucks are using these roads more than anything else. But it was surprising. Bears are actually one of the main users. This is just summer 2019 out of 1,500 events. But bears are one of the predominant users of these roads, as well as lynx and moose and wolves. About 7% of the events we have are wolves. I know I'm running out of time here. With policy, so how are we using some of this information? Ontario is a little bit unique in that it does actually have some policy for Wolverines. It's one of the few places that does have some sort of guidance to forestry and government on how to deal with Wolverine habitats. So it's the coarse and fine scale. The coarse is generally Wolverines are going to be under the umbrella of caribou. So there's the dynamic caribou habitat schedule trying to emulate natural disturbance patterns on the landscape with forestry. If you manage the landscape for caribou, the idea is underneath that umbrella, you also manage for Wolverines. So we're trying to dig into that question a little bit more with our data. We've been more involved recently at the fine scale with Wolverine den sites. So when den is found, the ministry has to create a den site management plan. This is a 4-kilometer AOC, area of concern, that just limits human activity around a den. And then there's monitoring of the female reuse of that area to understand whether that AOC can be lifted. So we've been trying to work with the ministry, work with forestry partners to apply not only this field collected data, but also expert opinion and knowledge, because there's people in WCS have worked with wolverines since early 2000. So we found 3 wolverine dens, one in a tree root wad, one in a rock crack. Pretty interesting den. It was in a real topographically, I mean, the boreal you think of being kind of flat, but in this area, lots of valleys and ups and downs and rock features. And this wolverine was denning right in a rock crack overlooking a big wetland bog area. And then we found one wolverine den in a slash pile. My work in Alberta, we also saw some of this use of slash pile and industry for den structures in Alberta. I had wolverines denning in rock cracks, or slash piles, log decks, and even the berms of borrow pits. So it continues here in Ontario. I guess 2 points on this den management process. One, there is this big focus on dens. I think we're most interested in how they're managing wolverines at the landscape scale. Wolverines are over huge areas. These females are relatively rare on the landscape. We got to make sure at a large scale that there's good female denning habitat, old forest, core kind of intact areas where these females feel secure to den. Those older forests are going to have also structures for females to den. These dens are really hard to find. So, you have this policy where you have to create a den management plan. It's great, but there's only been 4 wolverine dens found in Ontario, and they've all been found in Red Lake during WCS Canada projects. So they're very rare. It's not going to happen very much. Is there a better way that we can do this to monitor for reproductive ranges of females relative to just looking for these very kind of needle and haystack dens? Wolverines don't often reuse dens. A core part of the den management, the denning, the policy in the guidelines is you have to protect this den if it's reused by the female, but they don't often reuse dens. That's from work in Scandinavia. But they do reuse a denning area. So how do we monitor that denning area for reuse? Who's going to do that? Who's going to pay for that? These are all kind of tricky questions. Other ways to apply our data, a big part is wolverine response to habitats under forest management plans. So these forest management plans are going to have a big effects on these landscapes. We want to understand how these FMPs are going to affect wolverine habitats. So we comment on FMPs, but we also want to model these FMPs relative to wolverine habitat selection and try to understand, what guidance can we give to FMP development to make it better for wolverines. And that goes along with this idea of developing best management practices for wolverine habitats. Provide advice and revisions to forestry guides. A big part of that is working with the ministry and providing comments on policy, and updating the status assessment of wolverines. Provide some information on denning and abundance estimates to get a better idea of, are wolverines threatened in Ontario? Do we think the populations are still below 1,000 individuals? So that's it. If there's any questions. A big funder for us is the W. Garfield Weston Foundation. We've also received funding from Domtar, Evolution Mining, and the Species at Risk Stewardship Fund through Ontario. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Matt. That was really great. So if anyone has any questions, if you can direct them to the chat box just over in the corner. There's one question here. Will wolverines take another wolverine's abandoned den?
That is a good question. And I don't really know. I mean, one of the things I think in Ontario or in North America is we have very limited information on denning. A lot of the information we have on denning, as far as the wolverine research community in general, comes from Scandinavia, where they have a bit more social license to be invasive with wolverines, and they need to be really careful about monitoring wolverine populations because of their depredation on reindeer, which are herded in those landscapes for money. in those landscapes, what they find is that there's these denning areas, these fairly small areas that wolverines reuse time and time again, and that's not only the mom, that can also be, it's not only the mom, but it might also be the offspring or related individuals year after year using these specific areas. They really don't have much information on den reuse either. Generally, they're finding that the same female is not going to reuse the same den. I would suspect that I don't know this for sure, and I don't think anybody really does, but are other individuals going to reuse another person's den? I think that's a question we don't really know. My suspicion would be that they don't, but I don't know that for sure.
Great, thanks, Matt. Another question from Matt Dyson. He says, cool to see the research and policy connection so prominent in your work. Has your work been able to shed any light on kit survival or recruitment and habitat use? And what are their main predators?
Well, for example, F1, who was the first female that we monitored, she had a kit. She had a den and a kit, and that male grew up. He's M4, and we know he survived into being a juvenile, but he ended up getting trapped. So yeah, recruitment and some, at least he did live. He did get out of the den and was weaned, but he was killed. Yeah, there is this question of whether these industrial landscapes, whether it's all show, whether these yes, these females are having these kits, are they actually surviving into adulthood and producing, contributing to the population? And I would say yes. The wolverines that I worked with in Alberta, which I have more experience with, the wolverines we found in the dens generally survived into adulthood. Oftentimes they were killed. Juveniles are very susceptible to trapping. They make some poor decisions, and they end up getting killed. But they generally will get out of the kit. The habitat's good enough for the female to have the kit, to keep that kid alive, and for that to get to the weaning period, and then she supports them for sure through the summer, and then the kit's kind of on its own come next fall, and there's lots of evidence that they can survive into that in these industrial landscapes. Your other question was predators. I think there was just two questions there. The question of predators, I think when those kits are real young, I'm sure they have to worry about fishers, and they have to worry about martins and coyotes, and maybe to some extent wolves. But as they get older, I think the shift, it focuses probably mostly to wolves. There's evidence of wolverines. I've documented 3 wolverines getting killed by wolves. I mean, wolverines are, they're not a prey species. I think it's more they're a nuisance, and they are killed by wolves for that reason. You talk about caribou and wolverines, being very similar and having very similar habitat needs. It's interesting, caribou are much more threatened in the same landscapes that wolverines exist in. And I think in a lot of respects, that's because caribou are preyed on by wolves, but wolves are, they're going to have to go after caribou because it's actually something good to eat. Wolverines are more of a nuisance and a competitor. And I don't think that mortality is as big of a deal for wolverines in the Wolverine wolf world as it is the wolf caribou world. But
Awesome. Thanks again, Matt. So I'm just going to end here with one more question, and then we'll move on to Claire. So the last question for Matt is from Steve, and he says, thanks, Matt. Great talk. Do you know much about age? That is, age of first reproduction, males and females, maximum age, etc.
So there's some great, again, Scandinavia has produced some amazing research and on wolverines because of some of the reasons I talked about earlier. But generally, they're going to be able to reproduce at about age 3, and so they're having the females are, they mate all summer, super long mating period, which is interesting in itself, which probably has something to do with the fact that they're fairly low density and they, that maybe they need a more of an opportunity to run into each other out there. But they're generally having, starting to reproduce at age 3. I don't think they're particularly good at it when they're super young, and they get better, but they do go through senescence. So around probably age 4 or 5 to 7, they're pretty good at reproducing and raising those kits into adulthood, and then they tail off towards the end of their life. But they they generally mate every summer, and then they, whether they implant that blastocyst into the uterine wall come January, I think probably depends on a couple of things. One is habitat quality. One is whether they had, their condition, whether they had kits the previous year, um, and 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 then their age. So there's a lot of different factors that go into it, but generally it's thought that they give a general rule of thumb is they say start having kits at 3. They have kits every other year through the time they get fairly old, and then maybe one of the 2 kits survives. So they have kits every other year. They have 2 kits and one of them survives. So really low reproductive rates. And then mortality, maybe somewhere between 8 and 11 years is their life in the wild. So they don't have a lot of chance, right, to have kits. And so you got to make sure those females stay alive if you want that population to be in good shape. If they're only having kits every other year for a few, for however many years, maybe 4 to 7 or 4 to 8. There is some evidence in the prime of their age they'll have kits every year, but that's why, like, protecting these female reproductive areas, especially when they're kind of low density on the landscape in a place like Red Lake, southern edge of their distribution, there needs to be a bit of a focus on protecting those denning areas.
Great, thanks, Matt. If anyone else has any follow-up questions, we'll ask that you either forward them to us at info@octws.ca or to Matt himself. And with that, I am going to ask you, Matt, to stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
And then I will pass that over to Claire, who will be our second speaker today. So.
Okay, great. Can you see my screen, Kelly?
Yeah, you're good there. So Claire is a former interim freshwater research scientist and current associate conservation scientist in the Ontario Northern Boreal Landscape Program for Wildlife Conservation Society, Canada. Claire has dedicated her research and career to studying species at risk in boreal forests and waters, collaborating with the National Wildlife Research Centre of Environment Canada and working at the Centre for Northern Forest Ecosystem Research of the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. Over the past year, she co-led a research project on Namayo, lake sturgeon, in the far north in Ontario with WCS Canada and Moose Creek First Nation Resource Protection. So thanks for joining us today, Claire, and I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Kelly. I've minimized the chat view because I'm working from home and don't have a dual monitor. So if anything goes wrong, Kelly, just turn on your sound and yell at me to let me know. So awesome. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I saw some familiar names in the participant list, so that's great. So my webinar today is called Better Together, Combining Science and Stewardship of Namayo in the Moose River Basin. And as Kelly said, I also work with WCS Canada. Sorry, there seems to be a delay, and it's not changing the slide. There we go. So as Matt said, we're a science-based organization, specifically a non-governmental organization based in Ontario for me. So we're based in Thunder Bay, but we have offices all around Canada that do great research on a lot of wildlife and wild spaces. So what I'm going to be presenting on today is the ongoing research project between WCS Canada and Moose Cree First Nation. Not only is it a collaborative research project on Namayo or lake sturgeon, but it's very much co-led. Everything we do is together and everyone has approval and direction on where the project goes. And a main part of this means that we combine science and traditional ecological knowledge to accomplish the goals of the project. And those 4 goals are some of the things that we want our research project to accomplish. But the main kind of goals that apply to the presentation today is better understanding movement and behavior of Namayo in a natural river, which is the river that we'll be talking about today, and also making that information available. So presenting it in different ways and making information accessible to everyone. So in terms of the significance of far north in Ontario watersheds for sturgeon species, sturgeon are a very critically endangered species that was considered by the IUCN to have 85% risk of extinction for sturgeon species globally. And as we all know or may know, overfishing and fragmented rivers were some of the causes of losses to these populations, and many populations haven't recovered. But an interesting thing is that sturgeon species in the southern, what is now known as the southern Hudson Bay and James Bay lowlands, provide a contrast to the state of sturgeon species globally. So these waters are unfragmented and free from most industrial development. And species of lake sturgeon or lake sturgeon are not considered critically endangered there, which is a globally rare area. So a great study by Haxton and Cano found that there were only a few regions in the entire world where this was the case, that sturgeon were doing well and their waters were simultaneously unfragmented. And far north watersheds are one of these areas. So that brings us to kind of the project overview of what I'll be talking about today, which is a small portion of our research project. So that's studying and tracking Namayo or lake sturgeon in one of these intact rivers to provide what's called an Indigenous cultural reference state, or what we might understand as a baseline of river use, movement, and physiology. I'll also keep an eye on the time today, so if I may have to skip over a couple slides just to respect everyone's lunch hour. So the study river we have is the Kapano-Yosipi, or what I'll call the North French River during this presentation. And it is the little red line there at the southern tip of James Bay in the larger Moose River Basin and Moose Cree homeland. And so in this river, we established a telemetry network to monitor lake sturgeon using acoustic telemetry methodologies. So we had 7 and 1 receivers in the river. And what this means is that 7 receivers were called what is called VR2W receivers, and 1 was called VR2TX. And all this means is that the VR2TX, like the tagged fish, emit pings. So this was used to calculate detection efficiencies, which I'll get into later. So in total, we had an area of about 40 kilometers of the North French River covered. Each receiver was about 6 kilometers apart. And you'll see in this presentation that we don't provide exact receiver locations or exact locations of lake sturgeon. And there's basically 2 reasons for that. One is to protect the locations of lake sturgeon in the river, but it's also to protect the information and traditional ecological knowledge of the area in the Moose Cree homeland. So our project makes an effort to present findings of our research without giving away too much information about where these species are and what they're doing in the river. So the picture in the middle shows our kind of setup for 1 receiver in our telemetry network. So a float connected to a weighted anchor and cabling, which is either connected to an anchor or to the shore. And so this is a bunch of information telling us about the coverage, detection, and efficiency. Basically, we had an acoustic coverage after testing manually to see how far a receiver could hear a ping from a fish or a fish tag. And so the acoustic coverage of the river is about 18% by area. The detection efficiency, which was based on a paired VR2W and VR2TX receiver, was an average about 42%. But it's just important to note that the low end of these detection efficiencies are likely due to the fact that in low water periods, receivers can actually become out of the water or can be pushed up out of the water because of ice over. So these lower detection efficiencies are usually due to environmental conditions and are not the typical detection efficiencies. And furthermore, we tested the noisiness. So basically this means if a river is really loud, how well would we be able to detect a fish noise underwater? And that detection efficiency was quite good and noise was quite low. So in terms of how we captured fish, we tagged fish, and how we did physiological sampling, there were 3 capture events using gill nets, and we tagged 20 fish, some with tags that only output a fish ID, and some that also measured a fish ID, the acceleration of the tag at the time it was detected, and the pressure or depth of the tag when it was detected. So those are the total of 9 fish that were tagged within the study period. The fish were sedated using the lowest possible concentration, but in subsequent years it was found that e-gloves or electric gloves were a preferred method of sedation and were less deleterious to the fish, so that was the methodology used in subsequent years. And overall, this didn't take very long, and 3 attempts were used to draw blood for the physiological analysis. Now, once we got the telemetry data, you have to filter it, and anyone that's worked with acoustic telemetry data knows that the GLaDOS package is quite useful. So we filtered about 4% of detections identified as potentially false, and we removed an additional about 8.8% of detections based on a couple of parameters that are defined here. One is called non-fish detections. So what that means is any detection on a receiver that was from the VR2TX. So all fish tags are pinging. That VR2TX receiver is also pinging. We removed any detections from that. Furthermore, any detections from the VR2TX receiver itself. So even though we use the VR2TX to ping and classify those detection efficiencies, because it was so closely paired with another receiver, we didn't want to artificially increase the amount of detections in one segment of the river, so any detections from that receiver were removed. Lastly, we also assigned a 6-season classification to each detection. So instead of the 4 typical seasons, we use 6 seasons, because this generally better captures the hydrological changes a river goes through throughout the year. And these were based on river water levels and changes of an Environment Canada river station. So now we're going to get into how we estimated the use and movement of lake sturgeon in the river. So after consultation before I was brought on with community elders and members, they expressed the importance of the winter road in the North French River. And so we created 4 river segments to kind of qualify where lake sturgeon were using the river without identifying exact locations. And that metric that we used was called the average percent of fish days in a river segment, and the calculations there, and just in the interest of time, I'll move on, but if you have any questions, just follow up. And to estimate movement, we had a challenge with the limited telemetry network that we had. So we only had 7 receivers, which is not a very wide or amount of receivers. So we wanted to create a proxy of movement rates based on the best available information we had. So we did that using the measured movement within seasons. So the average daily distance traveled for a sturgeon, meters per day, was based on the total amount of distance it moved within a season divided by the number of days within that season. And we'd just like to point out that this is likely underestimating movement distances, because if sturgeon moved outside of the range of a receiver, we wouldn't be able to capture that movement rate. So in terms of how we modeled movement and river use, we used the GLMM-TMB package, or generalized mixed linear models, to analyze effects of our covariates, so season, mass, triglyceride, cholesterol, and total protein levels, on our response variables, which were the average daily distance traveled, the maximum daily acceleration, and the maximum daily depth. Also, average daily distance traveled, if you know about sturgeon are sedentary a lot of the time. So this created a statistical challenge in terms of zero inflation of our data. But luckily, the GLMM-TMB package allows you to include a zero inflation metric in your model, which is what we moved forward with. Moving on to results, you'll see that we have kind of a two-step modeling approach. One where we use a global model approach where we only include season and mass, and a second model approach using all covariates, including physiology. And the reason why we didn't just move forward with only a global approach with all variables or only a model selection approach with all variables is because we only attained physiology for 75% of sample sturgeon. So it pretty dramatically decreased our sample size. So we just wanted to account for that and do a kind of two-stepped approach. So moving on to the tagging and detection, we recorded over 2 million detections, and all fish were generally recorded within the range of the receiver. I'm going to skip a bit of that description just in the interest of time and move on to the results of lake sturgeon use and occupancy in those 4 river segments that you see in the figure here. So in general, over the course of the study period, lake sturgeon were using all segments of the North French River. But in particular, the segment upstream or south of the winter road here in the first red arrow was the most occupied, and it accounted for 80% of all fish detections in all 6 seasons. Furthermore, a very interesting part of what we found is that we identified 2 overwintering areas for lake sturgeon, the segment furthest north and the segment south of the winter road. This seasonal use described in this picture also shows evidence of two-step migration, which has been classified in literature. And basically this means that if you look at the fall section here, we see that when lake sturgeon are moving all throughout the North French River, in the summer, we see that they begin to move towards their overwintering areas in the fall, and this has been described as two-step migration. So when we look at the model findings for lake sturgeon movement for the average daily distance traveled, the main finding here is that season was the most influential variable. In the first model, including only season and mass, it showed a significant effect of season, and that can be shown on the right-hand side graph there as well. And when we used a model selection approach, including physiology variables, season was also a significant and influential variable. Furthermore, we found an approaching significant effect of size on movement, so the average daily distance travel, and this direction of effect was positive, meaning that larger lake sturgeon moved further average daily distances. We used acceleration as a secondary way to look at lake sturgeon movement, similar to average daily distance traveled. So we ran similar models, first the global approach, including only season and mass, and the second model selection approach. And we saw this similar effect of season and a significant effect of mass. But interestingly, the direction of effect for mass was opposite to the findings of average daily distance. So larger lake sturgeon actually had lower acceleration compared to larger lake sturgeon moving further distances. Lastly, there were significant effects of cholesterol and total protein on the maximum daily acceleration observed. I'm going to skip depth just because I know I'm running short on time and I want to give people an opportunity to ask questions. But in general, season was also included in both models as an influential and highly significant variable. So in terms of lake sturgeon movement and use summaries in the North French River, we found that the maximum observed movements, so in general, how far they moved in one season, how far they moved in one day, what was the maximum acceleration ever observed, all 3 of these descriptive variables were found to be in summer. So they moved a maximum of 87 kilometers in one summer. They moved a maximum of 1.4 kilometers in one day in summer. And the maximum acceleration was also in summer. And this is similar to other literature who have found that the maxima of lake sturgeon use and movement have been found in either spring or summer. So it's similar to those that have been found maxima in summer, but dissimilar from those who found maxima in spring. Despite these large distances traveled, most sturgeon in the North French River are sedentary, but some make huge movements. For example, one lake sturgeon moved 26.8 kilometers in 1 week. The depths we found that lake sturgeon occupied in the North French River, the range of these were generally what other literature has found. However, we didn't observe the highly deep pools that some other literature has shown, except this literature was, of course, in lotic systems, whereas the North French River is a river with shallower depths. In terms of lake sturgeon physiology, not only in the models we ran, we are excited to say that this study, to our knowledge, presents a novel reference interval for the physiological condition of lake sturgeon in an intact river. The only similar study we could find that presented reference intervals of how lake sturgeon physiology is faring in an intact system, or in any system, was in Deventry Jr. in 2012, who presented reference intervals for lake sturgeon physiology in the St. Lawrence River. And of course, we know that this isn't a very undeveloped river. So in terms of the novelty of these reference intervals and the importance for their use in future research, we're excited to present these ranges for triglyceride, cholesterol, and total protein. But in our supplementary materials, we also present the reference intervals for a variety of health ions. So in conclusion, we think that this study provides some great qualifications of sturgeon movement and physiology in an intact system. And because of this, it emphasizes the value of the area of the Moose River Basin for the Moose Cree homeland for sturgeon conservation on a global scale. So not only is this area important for the Moose Cree for conservation of lake sturgeon, but also it emphasizes how the Indigenous cultural reference state of the North French River is important for sturgeon conservation as a whole. Another important point is that communicating research effectively is challenging, and especially challenging when you want to communicate research differently. So moving forward, as we try to get this research published and communicate to the public, we'll use a variety of ways to do that. And lastly, it is very important for us to bring youth into our project. So a part of our lake sturgeon research project has a youth program component. And many of these sturgeon that we study will actually outlive us as scientists and us as people. So it's important to bring youth into this project and be engaged in the stewardship of Namayo moving forward. I'd just like to thank our funders, because this research would not be possible without it, as well as our community partners and co-leads on the project, and our technicians and consultants that have made this project happen, and give WCS Canada a follow on Twitter to keep track of our research, where it goes, and what we're doing. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Great presentation, Claire. Thank you so much. So if anyone has any questions, I'll ask you to please direct them now to the chat box. A question from Steve. He says, also a great talk, Claire. Are you able to sex the fish? And if so, any differences in movement for males versus females?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is possible to sex lake sturgeon, however, we didn't. So we're not looking at differences in male-female movement rates as of
now. Question from Matt Dyson. He says, thanks, Claire. You touched on this a bit in your conclusion, but any other insights or advice for researchers engaging First Nation communities in the research process?
That is a great question. I will say that I was brought onto this project a year ago, but the Lake Sturgeon Research Project has been ongoing and has been being built for, I think, about 4 or 5 years now. So I will speak to this, but just know that my expertise stems from about 1 year with the project. And my most useful bit of advice is that we as the research project, before I was brought on, developed what's called a Memorandum of Understanding with the First Nation of Moose Cree First Nation. And that's developed, I believe, also with a few lawyers, but it's basically a document you refer to about how you're going to communicate with one another, what are the understandings of the project, and with anything, including this presentation, you refer to the Memorandum of Understanding, giving each party a chance for input, development, giving the okay to go ahead with it. So having that document and that understanding and building that trust over time takes not only time and expertise, but also like legal expertise. But it's very rewarding, and I just say it takes time as well. So don't try to rush. You can't rush a process.
Great. That definitely sounds like a great way to engage. A comment here from Crystal. Thanks, Claire, for acknowledging the work you do with the First Nation you partner with. I think it's definitely clear that that's been really well done on this project, so kudos to you. I think with that, we'll ask that anyone either directs any follow-up questions to the OCTWS email or to Claire. Matt Dyson, I don't know if you have any follow-up comments, but I just really like to thank, again, Claire Farrell and Dr. Matt Scrafford for coming out and doing these talks for us today. We really appreciate your participation. They were great talks and very interesting. So hopefully if you're attending today, you learned something. Please feel free to check out our website for more information about our upcoming virtual AGM and conference, which will be, I believe, in March of next year. And with that, I wish you all a great day and hope to hear from you in the future.
Thanks, guys.